The third movement of the Mass in B minor, the second Kyrie, is an alla breve fugue, or alla breve fugue. This means that it is notated with long note values in what is commonly called cut time. But the term also implies that it is a fugue in the old style, the stile antico, looking back to the motets of the Renaissance, with text setting that is largely syllabic, one note per syllable, and with each new phrase initiated by a single voice which is then imitated by other voices. Each phrase constructed in this way is referred to as a punctum, or point of imitation, and these points always overlap with one another so that the music is continuous, never cadencing in all parts simultaneously until the end. This figure shows how a section of music in this style of counterpoint might be visualized, almost like interlocking puzzle pieces. The second Kyrie fugue is in a key that would have been thought of as rather remote and convoluted by most musicians of Bach's time, F-sharp minor. The multiplicity of sharps and the constant chromaticism in this fugue mean that even a well-trained modern musician will probably never feel completely comfortable performing it, and that, I think, is part of Bach's calculation. The subject, the main melodic idea of this fugue, is also somewhat tortured, twisting chromatically around the first degree of the scale, then rising effortfully to the fourth degree before sinking back to the tonic, and all of this spanning the notorious interval of a tritone. Kyrie eleison, eleison. The first four notes of the subject are a special figure that some music theorists of Bach's time called a circulatio, because the second note goes above the first, the third note dips below, and the fourth note comes full circle. Others identified this figure as a kreuz, or cross, because if you draw lines connecting the first and fourth notes and the second and third notes, you actually get a cross. Given that the cross is the ultimate symbol of Christ's mercy, it seems appropriate to attach that significance to the figure here. The basses are the first to state the subject. As they reach the concluding tonic, the tenors enter, singing the same melody only a fifth higher, and actually changing the key temporarily from F-sharp minor to C-sharp minor. This is called the answer. Meanwhile, the basses provide a complementary line to the tenor's answer called the counter-subject. This particular counter-subject neatly underscores the tenor's rising B-sharp to F-sharp figure with a similar figure that descends from F-sharp to B-sharp. Also notice the reversal of the words. The tenors sing Kyrie eleison, the basses sing eleison Kyrie. It's interesting, too, that the first, third, and fourth notes of the tenor answers, C-sharp, B-sharp, and C-sharp, 1, 7, and 1 in the key, are mirrored not once but twice in the counter-subject. The bass has it an octave lower and then at pitch. You're not likely to see that much economy of melodic material in any composer other than Bach. Following these entries, the tenors and basses spin out their melodic material for a couple of bars, measures 6 to 8, by way of a transition back to F-sharp minor, although the tenors actually surprise us by arriving at F-sharp major. At this point, the altos enter, singing the subject an octave higher than the basses did, and while they do so, it falls to the tenors to provide the counter-subject, a fourth higher than the basses sang it to fit in with the alto's key. Meanwhile, the basses are now free to sing whatever the composer wishes, and Bach has them add yet another tritone to the texture, measure 9, D to G sharp. Lastly, the sopranos enter, an octave and a fifth higher than the bass's original pitch, while the altos supply the counter-subject, the tenors sing harmonizing material, and the basses for the first time join the continuo instruments, which have been playing an independent bass line up until this point. At the moment that the choral and instrumental basses first join forces, it is to sing and play the following figure, which begins with an arresting syncopation. Zon Kyrie ele. This is the first suggestion of a motive that will soon attain considerable significance, becoming almost a second theme for the fugue. The new motive is further hinted at by the tenors in measure 15 and the altos in measure 17. Then in measures 22 to 24, the tenors, high in their range, state it for the first time in its complete form. Non Kyrie eleison. In measures 31 to 34, this motive is taken up in quick succession by all the voices in turn, from bass to soprano, with an extra bass entry, in a type of imitation called stretto, where the voices interrupt one another and layer in on top of one another. In measures 43 to 45, we get another set of stretto entries of this motive, this time in the order alto, soprano, bass, tenor, and with an extra soprano entry. And then in measures 51 to 53, a final stretto with all the voices high in their range and the entries cascading down from soprano to bass provides the powerful climax of the entire fugue. Without going into every detail of Bach's treatment of the subject in this fugue, it will suffice to point out that, like the secondary motive we just discussed, the subject also appears in stretto, in the two inner voices at measures 35 to 38, then in the two outer voices in measures 40 to 43, along with a really good try from the altos who gamely contribute the first two notes of an entry, and once more in the two outer voices at measures 54 to 57, this final one beginning with a big syncopation in the bass so that no one will miss it. An effortful climb to the fourth scale degree was a feature of the subject that we noted earlier. Twice during the course of the fugue, Bach incorporates this idea into his bass line, apart from the subject. At measures 17 to 18, the instrumental basses, along with the violas and choral tenors, have a chromatically filled in rising fourth. And at about the midpoint of the fugue, having just tonicized C-sharp in measure 27, the instrumental and choral basses claw their way up to the fourth degree of that key by semitones, seemingly clinging to musical tow ropes held by the three upper voices, which are also climbing upward at this point. 17th century music theorists sometimes referred to figures like this chromatically rising forth as a passus duriosculus, a harsh or difficult passage. There are passages in this fugue, as there are in most, where no one is singing or playing the subject. Such passages are called episodes, and the first one usually follows the exposition, that first set of statements of the subject. In this fugue, bars 14 to 18 constitute the first episode, and it's a fairly typical one in that it treats a short melodic figure sequentially. In other words, it links two or more stepped up or stepped down repetitions of a melodic figure. In this case, the sequence is a rising one in the soprano. A counterpoint to the soprano line, which is split between the altos and the tenors, is sequenced along with it. Only the last 5 notes are an exact sequence. One of the fugue's later episodes, at measures 38 to 40, is worth mentioning not only because it involves two voices in a delightful descending back and forth double sequence, but because it's an example of another feature typical of episodes. Like many of them, it is harmonized using a circle of fifths progression. Note the bass movement over these 3 measures from C sharp to F sharp to B to E to A to D to G. Actually, to say this passage is harmonized using the circle of fifths is an understatement. All 3 lines are the circle of fifths, really, in outline, the bass being the most complicated of the 3. And one also sees how the concept of sequence is so tied up with the idea of circle of fifths. Here is the bass line. And here is the alto line. You can see that it sort of trails behind the bass line. When the bass line moves from C sharp to F sharp, the alto initiates the C sharp. When the bass line moves from the F sharp to the B, the alto goes from the C sharp to the F sharp. It's lagging one step behind, so that it's always forming a fifth with the bass. The tenor line, does something quite clever. It starts its circle of fifths 2 degrees back from where the bass started. It starts on a substitution for the D sharp, a D natural, and it goes to a G sharp. There's that tritone again. But it does so so as to form a third above the bass each time. When the bass is on B, the tenor is on D. When the bass goes to E, the tenor's on G sharp, and so on. And then something wonderful happens. At the moment that the alto voice goes to a G natural and the tenor voice goes to an E, and the bass would have gone to a C natural if it was continuing its circle, that C natural is supplied instead by the entering subject in the soprano part, and that flat 2 of the subject on B happens to be the very note that the circle of fifths requires at that point. There's nothing Bach likes to do more than to sum up at the end of a piece. He loves to take some feature that he's been toying with and working with throughout the piece and bring it all home with telling force just before the cadence usually. And so you see the second last bar of this fugue, all 4 voices have melodic tritones simultaneously. And the piece ends on a tierce de Picardie, a turn to the major at the end of a minor movement, which is very common in the Baroque. But in this case, it was foreshadowed by that surprising F sharp major cadence we had at the end of the tenor's first answer. Clearly, the emotion of the text, Lord have mercy, is expressed in both the material and the structure of this fugue. It is not too fanciful to think of the subject itself, with its chromatic twists and its upward yearning, as representing a soul in anguish, imploring God's forgiveness. The opening entries rising from the bass to the soprano convey the idea of a collective prayer rising to heaven from many voices. The use of stretto intensifies the emotion as the cries for mercy literally become more impatient to be heard. The syncopated motive, at first pent up, finally comes pouring out a heartfelt plea. And the constant chromaticism, including the frequent use of tritones, gives the piece an unsettled, searching quality throughout.